Jimi Hendrix played guitar in a way nobody had ever seen. Right-handed guitar, strung backwards, played upside down with his left hand. Music experts call it genius, but it started as a child hiding from his father's fists. If you ever watched Jimi Hendrix play guitar, even in old footage, you probably noticed something looked different. His guitar seemed backwards. The strings were in the wrong order. His hand positions looked impossible. Other guitarists would watch him play and literally couldn't figure out how he was doing what he was doing. That's because Jimi was playing a right-handed Fender Stratocaster flipped upside down, with the strings restrung for a left-handed player. It's one of the most iconic images in rock and roll. Jimi with his guitar seemingly backwards, creating sounds that nobody thought possible. But this wasn't a gimmick. It wasn't a style choice. It was the result of childhood trauma, poverty, and a father who believed that being left-handed was a moral failing that needed to be beaten out of his son. To understand how Jimi developed his unique playing style, you have to go back to Seattle in the 1940s and 1950s, to a small house in a poor neighborhood, and to a little boy who was born left-handed in an era when that was considered wrong. James Marshall Hendrix came into the world on November 27, 1942, naturally left-handed. As a baby and toddler, he reached for things with his left hand, held his bottle with his left hand, pointed with his left hand. This was completely natural to him. It's how his brain was wired.
But to his father, Al Hendrix, this was a problem, a serious problem. In the 1940s and 1950s, particularly in conservative and working-class communities, left-handedness was seen as abnormal at best and sinful at worst. Some people believed it was a sign of the devil. The Latin word for left is sinister, which also means evil or ominous. Teachers forced left-handed children to write with their right hands. Parents punished kids who showed left-handed tendencies. Al Hendrix had grown up in this environment. His own father had beaten the left-handedness out of him when he was a child. Al had learned to do everything right-handed, even though it never felt natural. And now his son was showing the same defect that Al had been punished for. So Al did what had been done to him. He started forcing young Jimi to use his right hand for everything. When Jimi reached for food with his left hand at the dinner table, Al would slap his hand away. "Use your right hand," he'd say. "What's wrong with you?" When Jimi tried to write or draw with his left hand, Al would take the pencil away and put it in his right hand. If Jimi switched back, there would be punishment. Sometimes a slap, sometimes a belt, sometimes just harsh words that cut almost as deep. "I'm not raising a sinister child," Al would say, using that old Latin connection between left and evil. "You're going to learn to do things the right way."
For young Jimi, this created a confusing and painful situation. His brain told him to use his left hand. It felt natural, easy, correct. But his father told him it was wrong, shameful, something to be corrected. So Jimi learned to do what many left-handed children of that era learned to do. He became functionally ambidextrous, using his right hand in public and his left hand in secret. At school, he wrote with his right hand, even though his handwriting was terrible and writing hurt his hand. At the dinner table, he ate with his right hand, awkwardly switching the fork back and forth. In front of his father, he did everything right-handed. But when Al wasn't looking, when Jimi was alone in his room or playing with other kids away from adult supervision, his left hand would take over. It was like a part of himself he had to hide, a secret identity that only came out when it was safe. This created deep psychological effects that Jimi would carry for his entire life. He learned to hide parts of himself. He learned that who he naturally was wasn't acceptable. He learned to present one version of himself to authority figures while keeping his true self hidden. Then, when Jimi was about 12 years old, he discovered the guitar, and everything changed. His first guitar was actually a broom. He'd seen musicians on TV and in magazines, and he was fascinated by how they held their guitars, how their hands moved, how they created music. So he'd hold a broom like a guitar and pretend to play along with songs on the radio.
Al caught him doing this one day, and in a rare moment of softness, actually found it amusing. He took a photo of young Jimmy holding that broom like a guitar, grinning at the camera. That photograph would later become famous, but in the moment, it was just a father seeing his son happy. Eventually, Al bought Jimmy his first real guitar, a cheap acoustic that cost $5. It was a right-handed guitar because that's what guitars were. Left-handed guitars existed, but they were rare and expensive. A poor family in Seattle wasn't going to special order a left-handed guitar for a kid who probably wouldn't stick with it anyway. So Jimmy had a right-handed guitar. And here's where the conflict came to a head. When Jimmy tried to play the guitar right-handed, holding it the way a right-handed person would, it felt completely wrong. His left hand wanted to do the complex work of fretting the notes, while his right hand did the simpler work of strumming. That's how a left-handed person plays guitar naturally. But Al had spent years forcing Jimmy to do everything right-handed. When he saw Jimmy trying to play the guitar backwards, left-handed, he got angry. "You're going to play it the right way," Al told him, "like a normal person." He took the guitar away and showed Jimmy how to hold it right-handed, with the right hand on the fretboard and the left hand strumming. To a left-handed person, this is backwards and incredibly difficult. But Jimmy tried. He tried so hard to make his father happy, to be normal, to do things the right way.
He practiced playing right-handed until his fingers hurt. He tried to train his brain to accept this backwards approach, but it never felt right. It never felt natural, and he could never get good at it. So Jimmy did something clever, something rebellious, something that would eventually change rock and roll forever. When his father wasn't around, he would take that right-handed guitar and flip it upside down. The fat E string, which was normally on top, was now on the bottom. The thin E string, normally on the bottom, was now on top. Everything was reversed. But Jimmy discovered something amazing. Even with the strings in the wrong order, playing the guitar left-handed felt right. It felt natural. His left hand wanted to do the complex fretting work, and when he held the guitar this way, it could. So he started restringing the guitar himself. He'd take all the strings off and put them back on in reverse order, so that when he flipped the guitar upside down, the strings were in the correct order for a left-handed player. High E on the bottom, low E on top. Then, when he heard his father coming, he'd stop playing and hide the guitar, or he'd frantically try to switch it back to the right position. He became expert at quickly taking the strings off and restringing them, or just hiding his left-handed playing entirely. This went on for years. During the day, Jimmy was the right-handed son his father demanded. At night, in his room, with the door closed, he was a left-handed guitarist, practicing for hours, developing his own unique style.
And here's where the abuse actually created genius. Because Jimmy was playing a right-handed guitar upside down, even with the strings restrung, the whole instrument was still designed for a right-handed player. The controls were in different places. The cutaway that made it easier to reach high frets was on the wrong side. The strap buttons were positioned differently. A normal left-handed guitar would have been symmetrical, designed specifically for left-handed players. But Jimmy didn't have that. He had a right-handed guitar flipped over, and he had to adapt to all its quirks and challenges. This forced him to develop completely unique techniques. The way he used his thumb to fret bass notes on the low E string, that was partly because the neck of his upside-down guitar sat differently in his hand. The way he could play rhythm and lead simultaneously, That came from adapting to the unusual control layout. The way he used feedback and bent strings, all of it was influenced by playing an instrument that was literally backwards. Other guitarists would later say that Jimi's style was impossible to copy, and they were right. Nobody else was playing a right-handed guitar upside down with the strings reversed. Nobody else had spent years developing techniques specifically to overcome the challenges of that setup. Al eventually discovered what Jimi was doing. He came home early one day and caught Jimi playing guitar left-handed with the strings all reversed. Al's reaction was predictable. Anger, disappointment, another failed attempt to make his son normal.
But by this point, Jimi was a teenager, and he'd gotten good enough at guitar that he wasn't going to stop. He'd found something he loved, something he was talented at, and no amount of punishment was going to take that away from him. "I can't play it the other way," Jimi told his father. "I've tried. This is the only way I can make it sound right." Al eventually gave up the fight, at least when it came to guitar. Jimi still had to eat right-handed, write right-handed, do everything else right-handed in public, but the guitar became his rebellion, the one place where he could be authentically himself. Years later, when Jimi was famous, interviewers would ask him about his unusual playing style. He'd usually give simple answers, "I'm left-handed," or "It's just how I learned." He rarely talked about the abuse, about being forced to hide a fundamental part of himself, about turning that pain into art. But people who knew him well understood. Noel Redding, his bass player, said, "Jimi's whole approach to the guitar was about overcoming obstacles. He'd been told his whole life that the way he was naturally was wrong, so he found a way to be himself anyway, even if it meant playing a backwards guitar." Mitch Mitchell, his drummer, added, "Everything Jimi did on guitar was technically wrong according to traditional teaching, but he made it right. He made it beautiful. That was his genius. Taking what everyone said was wrong and proving it was better than right."
The psychological effects of this childhood experience ran deep. Throughout his life, Jimi struggled with feeling like he had to hide his true self. He was shy in interviews, often letting others speak for him. He felt more comfortable expressing himself through music than through words. But on stage, with his backwards guitar in his hands, he was free. He was himself. He could do things that were wrong according to convention, but that created beauty and power and sounds nobody had ever heard before. Music therapists and psychologists who've studied Jimi's life point to this early experience with forced-handedness as a key to understanding both his genius and his struggles. He learned early that authority figures would try to change who he fundamentally was, so he learned to hide, to adapt, to find secret ways to be himself. The backwards guitar became a symbol of this. Every time he stepped on stage with that upside-down Stratocaster, he was making a statement. "I will be who I am, even if it looks wrong to you. I will find a way to make my authentic self not just acceptable, but extraordinary." Today, left-handedness is understood to be a natural neurological variation. About 10% of people are left-handed, and it's recognized as completely normal. Children aren't forced to switch hands anymore. Left-handed guitars are common and affordable. But in Jimi's time, he had to fight for the right to play guitar the way his brain told him to. And in that fight, in that struggle against authority and convention, he developed a style that would change music forever.
Every time you see footage of Jimi Hendrix playing his upside-down guitar, remember, you're not just seeing a unique playing style. You're seeing the result of childhood trauma transformed into art. You're seeing rebellion against arbitrary authority. You're seeing the child who was beaten for being left-handed grow up to become the greatest left-handed guitarist who ever lived. You're seeing someone who was told, "You're wrong," his entire childhood respond by creating something so beautiful, so powerful, so undeniably right that the whole world had to admit
They were wrong about him. That backwards guitar wasn't just an instrument. It was a statement. It was proof that sometimes the wrong way is actually the right way. That sometimes what looks backwards is actually forward. That sometimes genius comes from refusing to conform, even when conforming would be easier. Al Hendrix lived long enough to see his son become a legend. He saw millions of people celebrate the very thing he'd tried to beat out of his son. He saw left-handed kids inspired by Jimi to pick up guitars and play them proudly left-handed. We don't know if Al ever apologized for trying to change something that didn't need changing, but we know that Jimi forgave him in his way. He understood that Al was a product of his time, repeating the abuse that had been done to him.
And Jimi did what all great artists do. He took his pain and made it into something beautiful. He took his father's rejection of his left-handedness and turned it into the most iconic image in rock and roll. Every backwards guitar, every impossible chord, every sound that made people ask, how is he doing that? It all came from a left-handed child who refused to pretend to be right-handed even when it would have been easier, even when it would have prevented the beatings, even when everyone told him he was wrong. He was left-handed, and he made that beautiful. If this story of turning trauma into triumph moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to know that the things that make them different aren't defects, they're gifts. Have you ever been told to hide who you really are? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like this video for more untold stories from music's greatest legends.